Jobs are important, of course, but most important, our technical skills, our knowledge, all these things are going. As I said, 15, 20 years ago, we completely designed our own cars. We had hundreds of people engaged in designing and in planning and in the general technology in that area. That's nearly all gone now.
That's Joe Thompson, former Secretary of the Vehicle Builders Union. The recent announcement that General Motors Holdens had made a $100 million loss in 1985 surprised many economic forecasters. They'd expected the loss to be higher. Manufacturing is not particularly profitable in Australia these days, and now even the multinational car companies are feeling the pinch. Tonight, in the second part of the Holden story, we'll trace the boom and bust of General Motors in Australia and then go on to examine where the technological revolution in manufacturing is taking us. But first, let's go back to the post-war years when our industry was growing and competitive, when we made our own car and it was king of the road. In the 41 years since World War II, Australia's population has more than doubled. But during that same time, the number of cars has increased almost eightfold. And the number of car makers in this country has grown from one American company, General Motors, to 5. In the post-war years, the Australian-made Holden played an integral role in Australia's growing industrial base. At that time, we had our own car built for Australian conditions. Today, that uniquely Australian car industry has changed. The shape of a 1986 Holden Commodore originated in a computerized German design studio, while its fully imported Nissan engine was built in a robotized factory in Japan. Today's Holden is a world car. One of the keenest observers of these changes in our motor industry is journalist and writer Peter Davis. He's an authority on the post-war Holden.
When GMH introduced the Holden, it became very popular very quickly and was considered to be by far the most suitable car and the best value on the Australian market. So by 1955 to 1960, the Holden completely dominated this market and GMH could sell every single car they could build.
The phenomenal demand for the locally made car flowed on to broader industrial growth across the country. New factories meant a demand for production workers. In 1958, GMH's new body plant at Elizabeth, near Adelaide, was opened by Queen Elizabeth. She was welcomed by hundreds of loyal English subjects who'd received assisted passages to come to Australia and work for General Motors. Increasingly, our national fortunes were becoming intertwined with the multinational car producer.
Over the late 1950s and early 1960s, various state governments had put a lot of pressure onto GMH. They'd said, in effect, look, we are buying large numbers of cars from you for our state and instrumentalities and so on. We want a quid pro quo. We want an assembly plant in our state to employ our people. So GM ended up with a total of 7 such assembly plants in 5 states. They stretched all the way from Perth to Brisbane.
This inefficiency, which would eventually decimate GMH, was masked by record growth and a corporate image of national benevolence.
From the drawing board onward, Holden is Australian through and through. Not just adapted here from overseas models, but built here. Make no mistake about it, Holden is the only car designed and built in Australia for Australian motorists. From the tiniest nuts to the biggest component, 97% of Holden is all Australian content.
By 1960, with over half the market and an annual profit of £15 million, Holden had become GM's most successful subsidiary. In fact, Detroit was becoming concerned that it could be seen to be monopolising the market. GM need not have worried, because in 1960, Ford, eyeing off General Motors' huge Australian profits, entered the local scene with their Falcon, taken directly from an American design. Ford promoted their car as an equal to Holden, but initially it fell short of the local product. General Motors had expected the arrival of its traditional competitors, Ford and Chrysler, but all 3 were to underestimate the small car market in Australia. During the 50s, Lawrence Hartnett had tried unsuccessfully to make the small Hartnett car in Australia. When he saw the Datsun Bluebird being trialled in rallies around Australia, he recognised its potential. He went to Japan to develop the car for a commercial Australian release. The venture was far more successful than the Japanese expected, and for a moment, Hartnett thought he had another Holden on his hands.
When Nissan came to me and said they wanted to be #1 in the market, I said the only one is make it here. It's all right, why not? But if you really want to scoop the pool, take 50% Australian capital. Yes, why not? So we prepared the plan, and all the government departments approved it. And I had our finances underwritten by a merchant banker. And but then finally the government here turned it down. They said it was disturbing to the people existing here, meaning General Motors and Ford, I presume. So unfortunately, it was set aside. That upset the Japanese, and so they didn't renew my contract and set it up themselves.
Had Australia decided to make this car, the Hartnett, or later the Datsun, our traffic obviously would have looked different. More importantly, our industry would not have been locked in to an American style of manufacture with increasingly large and powerful cars.
This is the new Holden, powered to perform in great new style. Now with 2 completely new engines. The new 100 horsepower engine boosts Holden power by 33%. The new 115 horsepower engine boosts Holden power by 53%.
In 1963, GMH, with its place in the market secure, installed a new engine plant at Fisherman's Bend. The famous red engine, so called because of its paint job, would, with a few modifications, power Holdens for over 20 years. The prosperous mid-60s meant high employment, cheap land and cheaper cars. More and more families left the inner city for new suburban estates with plenty of room for kids and cars. During the early 60s, market growth was so strong that Holden could charge the same price for its cars year after year, £1,051. In 1965, the market showed the first signs of tapering off. In 1966, General Motors countered with elaborate advertisements encouraging women to drive. It was the beginning of the 2-car family campaign. By 1968, the General Motors subsidiary, faced with increasing competition from Ford, Chrysler, and now Japan, was losing its market share. Detroit raised its new car price for the first time in a decade.
Always, as far back as I can recall, major decisions, even pricing decisions, have been made in New York or in Detroit and not in Australia. I can recall times when we've asked at press conferences what will be the price of the new models, and we have been told we haven't had a reply for our telex yet to New York. And styling and other engineering decisions were made largely by Americans, men who perhaps did not fully understand the market implications.
Detroit countered the increasing competition not by upgrading its far-flung Australian factories, but by diversifying its range of model styles. In 1968, GMH began work on a new generation of Holdens. The first to be totally designed and developed in Australia, the Kingswood would have a larger body, while the Tirana would look after the small car market. They would be the most Australian Holdens ever made, but even so, they still looked American.
I know you probably wouldn't like this, but the designs themselves, although they're meant to be Australian, look actually pretty American.
Well, a lot of people feel this, but ourselves, we don't believe it to be the case.
Although the designers felt they were onto something new, the cars would still be made the same old way. GMH began tooling up for the Kingswood amidst industrial turmoil. The 25,000-strong workforce had never been bigger, but the factories were aging and morale was low.
GMH stuff for the people of Holden, and my guys have 5 million in profit. They don't make. We make with their shot, with their muscle, because we work hard, very hard.
We believe that the cars that are manufactured in GMH, they are good cars, they are second to none on the road, they belong in the 20th century. But the conditions under which we manufacture these cars are bad conditions, and they belong in the...
The Kingswood was the culmination of the American-dominated 60s style. During that decade, it had grown half a ton heavier, 4 times as powerful, and twice as thirsty as the original Holden.
At one stage, about 70% of all cars sold in Australia were what the industry called the medium light, which is this size car. It's now down to about 50%, and this figure will fall maybe to 25 or 30%. They will be replaced by much more compact cars. Strangely enough, cars much closer in size and power-to-weight ratio, I think, to the original 1948 Holden.
The crunch came in 1973 with the first petrol shock. Fuel prices doubled and doubled again. Holden sales plummeted, to be replaced mostly by Japanese imports. During the 60s, the Japanese had refined their production line methods to reduce lead times, minimize inventories of components, and improve quality through worker involvement. The result was small, economical cars that stormed the world market.
Had Australia had not necessarily Australian ownership, but at least executives and top executives and people who could make decisions on here in Australia who understood this market, I'm sure the impact of the competition and the other factors would have been much less. GMH probably would not have got into the slide they got into, and even if they had, by making the right decisions, they would have got out of it earlier. So as their market slipped, so did their ability slip to create the money necessary to take command of the market by investing in new technology for the design and new technology for the factories.
In 1977, Detroit decided to start rationalising its Australian operation. Chuck Chapman and a group of engineers were brought in from GM's German works. With them came GM's world car design. It was married to the Kingswood engine and suspension to form the first Commodore. Holden was no longer an Australian car, but a world car.
The Commodore was a design which had been introduced in Europe, or was in the process of being introduced, and was chosen as an optimum for that particular fuel economy, aerodynamic, functional demand that was thrusting itself upon the world markets.
70, 70, 80, sir. 80, I'm bid 90, $90.
In an effort to consolidate the operation, Chapman has overseen the closure of plants in all states except Victoria and South Australia. The arrival of the world car has heralded a major change in the way cars are made at GMH. In the past decade, thousands of skilled workers have lost their jobs.
Yeah, I had a goal watch. They gave me a goal watch for 25 years and wished me good luck, and next year I was out the gate.
In many cases, the workers have been replaced by automation. Since 1980, General Motors has spent over $500 million converting its Australian plants to CAD/CAM, which stands for Computer-Aided Design and Computer-Aided Manufacture. This links GMH with General Motors' other plants in Brazil, Germany, Spain, and England. With CAD/CAM, a car design still starts as a clay model, although these days the original concept probably comes from Germany. The shape of the clay model is then measured in a three-dimensional grid of X, Y, and Z coordinates. These are fed into a computer and the points are joined to make a three-dimensional diagram. The overall shape is now placed in the hands of engineers who divide up the computer image to form individual components. Ironically, although the world car concept has given GMH access to the latest technology, it has reduced their creative control. Once, total design was carried out in Australia. Now, most time is spent modifying components to meet local standards, or making sure they can be made with local equipment. With computer-aided design, the digital diagrams can be fed directly into the die-making machines which shape the components for the presses. Today's presses are relatively flexible. It's an easy matter to switch from making one component to another. GMH press lines in Elizabeth punch out panels for Mazda and Nissan, as well as Holden. In the Elizabeth body plant, computer-aided manufacture means components are fed into islands of automation, where worker and robots work side by side. The old labour-intensive methods of engine production have also been drastically changed with computerised automation. The six-cylinder and V8 production line, first commissioned in 1963 to make the red engine, closed in 1985. With it went hundreds of skilled production workers. In its place is a world car production line making the four-cylinder Family 2 engine. On the modern line, automated equipment handles most of the precision work, while workers prepare components for machine assembly or check for defects. On the old production line, one of the most skilled and sought-after jobs was to start up and test the new engines. But this once familiar sound of a Holden 6 warming up is rapidly becoming a thing of the past. Now, the procedure is far more objective. Computers dispassionately monitor engine performance with almost clinical precision. With CAD/CAM, it's the computer programmers who have all the fun. The Family 2 engine has become one of Australia's leading exports. Over $1 million worth are sent to GM plants in England and Germany every day. They'll power Opels in Germany, Vauxhalls in England, and Chimeras in Australia. In return, GMH imports fully built-up Commodore engines and transmissions from Nissan in Japan. But despite this, GMH is still making a loss on the Commodore. Part of this problem is the low value of the Australian dollar. Another aspect is the extraordinary capital outlay that GM has made to automate its factories.
This whole process is an evolutionary one, and it happens in different degrees in different processes in the organization. But we've proved to ourselves beyond a doubt that it's the only way to compete. You just cannot produce a high-quality product at a competitive cost level without adopting it.
Well, that may be so, but GMH isn't looking too competitive today. In fact, if it weren't the subsidiary of the world's largest vehicle manufacturer, it's doubtful it would survive. If it is to survive, it won't be due to special treatment from the federal government. Senator John Button, Minister for Industry, Technology and Commerce, is the architect of the government's vehicle rationalisation plan, which aims for fewer models, greater standardisation, and probably fewer manufacturers. Survival of the fittest seems to be his message.
Look, we are concerned with a plan which allows the companies involved to operate in the marketplace. Some of them are succeeding, some of them are not. General Motors appears to be one of those which is not succeeding at the moment. Now that is a corporate decision for them, what they do about that. It's not a matter for a government minister to comment about.
Well, indeed, the industry people I spoke to last night said to me that the road to success for the vehicle industry in Australia now is not to do with directly your plan, but with their own investment, which depends on protection.
Well, they may have said that to you. I don't...
Do they say that to you?
I mean, it is still a very highly protected industry in Australia. And if they're saying to you that it depends on more protection, that they require more protection in order to make investments, well, they better say it to you and not to me, because they're not going to get that.
What about less protection?
Well, the plan embodies less protection over time.
So then how are they going to survive?
Well, it's up to them. They know. I mean, look, the industry knows, it's been expressed by senior industry spokesmen. They've got to improve their competitiveness by, I think, a factor of 7% a year until 1992. If they do that, they'll be in business. They know that. And I believe they can do that. Whether individual companies can all do it is a different question. You're concerned with General Motors. I don't know whether they can do it. I believe they could.
Well, he's hopeful, but only just. If GMH is to pull through, it's got to deal with even more problems as it moves towards high-tech manufacture, the same level of manufacturing the Americans are relying on to get their industry back into competitive shape. Here in Detroit, the home of the American automotive industry, the problems that were afflicting GMH were even being felt by the huge parent company. Right throughout the 1970s, General Motors, still the world's biggest manufacturing company, was seeing its markets eaten away because it couldn't compete with the Japanese. The effects on the city of this downturn, the social effects, are still visible. In 1980, with hundreds of Detroit factories closing and thousands of workers unemployed, GM prepared for the production of what it thought was a competitive small car. By this time, GM had bought into the Japanese manufacturer Isuzu. Isuzu assessed GM's small car and concluded that they could produce it for about half the US cost. GM was shocked. They realized they had to do something or go under. So they allocated $5 billion to set up a new high-tech corporation, the Saturn Project, to completely rethink car production and beat the Japanese. The aim? A new small car built in an entirely new way.
One of the things that came out of Project Saturn is there's three basic streams that had to be changed in our perspective in order to come out with a new way of developing a vehicle. One, the technology was changing very rapidly. And in order to manage that technology, the people systems that we have had to change also very dramatically. And in conjunction with that, the whole systems side of the business had to change very dramatically. So to tie the technology and the people and the systems in together, we've turned more and more to the use of computers.
Saturn has yet to make a car, but some of its research is already finding a place in other car plants in Detroit. The heart of the Saturn concept is called SIM, which stands for Computer Integrated Manufacture. SIM is an advance on the CAD-CAM process which exists in Australia. GM has developed a computer language which will take the various automated sections of CAD-CAM and join them together. Eventually, they plan to form an entirely automated factory.
That's what computer integrated manufacturing is all about, is the connection through the computer of lots of different parts of that process of manufacturing a vehicle or a TV set or whatever it might be. And that includes the scheduling aspects, telling the system that this particular car is a 2-door instead of a 4-door, so when the paint system opens the doors, it only opens 2 instead of 4.
With this SIM communication system, GM has already started to tie formerly unconnected areas of automation together. In this plant, driverless vehicles are programmed to move partially built cars from one robotized production area to another, while computer-controlled forklift trucks keep the robots supplied with components. Now, even the checking and quality control functions, formerly done by people, have been automated. This vehicle is being scanned to make sure its panels are correctly aligned. The few workers left spend most of their time tracking down faults in the integrated system and repairing robots. As part of the restructuring process, General Motors is acquiring high-tech companies around the world. For example, it recently snapped up Hughes Aircraft Corporation for $8 billion. The research from these companies is then filtered through GM's own laboratories. The aim is to further streamline and automate each step in the production line so that it'll fit the SIM process. Where a new car design traditionally began with a clay model, now researchers are trying to do away with that in favor of a computer screen.
We're going to be able to see our ideas from any view, in any size, under any light source, in any color. We'll be able to blow up our ideas full size and evaluate them. We'll be able to develop through the technique of holograms a three-dimensional image that maybe someday will eliminate the need for a full-size clay model.
This is the F-car part.
With SIM, once each component is modelled on the computer, a program then tests whether the component can be made by automated machines. This does away with the need for prototypes.
This is 0.15.
With full automation, robots will need to communicate. In this lab, machine vision is being adapted to the production line. Here, a robot remembers a shape, sees the similarly shaped component, and picks it up. Robots like these have already been installed in GM plants, and it's expected that one day they'll be able to build an entire engine. On present performance, though, that day is a long way off. Their factories are still uncompetitive, so for GM to survive, SIM simply must be made to work.
If one thinks about the numbers of people and numbers of machines and numbers of communication bits that need to be done in a large manufacturing plant, it's almost mind-boggling. So it's a tremendously complex process. It's like the elephant, you eat that a bite at a time, and that really is the way that SIM is progressing. So, you know, if you look at the ultimate and you say, boy, we're not there yet, when can we get there? Well, we'll get there sooner than we think, but not as soon as we'd like.
In the meantime, Saturn expects to be producing 500,000 cars a year by 1990, using only 6,000 workers. By comparison, Australia uses 26,000 workers to produce the same volume. And the awful truth behind that equation is that more Australian jobs in the vehicle industry will be lost. But that's not all we'll lose, according to Joe Thompson, former secretary of the Vehicle Builders Union.
What frightens me is that the decisions as to what we will make in Australia and what parts we will make has now been taken out of the hands of Australia, and that will be decided in the boardrooms of either Detroit or in New York.
And what are the consequences for Australia, for the industry?
Well, it means that, in my view, it will mean that all the skillful occupations we're going to lose. We'll be relegated to the unskilled jobs on the assembly line. And bear in mind that the motor industry has always been the great generator of skills. We'll lose all that. The skillful work will be done mainly in Asia, and we'll be relegated to the unskilled jobs on the assembly line.
So in other words, you're saying that potentially all of Australian manufacturing capacity could suffer?
Yes. Much of it has suffered now, of course. Because I go back to, say, 20 years ago, when in Australia we did all our own designing. We had huge numbers of people engaged in clay modelling for designing. There was great skills in the industry. Much of it has already gone, and the little bit that is left, that will go with the Saturn program, no doubt about that.
So then what can you see in terms of the Australian workforce right now? 26,000 or thereabouts, I think, right now. I mean, what's your forecast for the future? Is that's going to plummet?
That will plummet. There's no doubt about that. And let me make one point clear. I don't mind it plummeting with new technology. In fact, I'm all in favour of new technology, providing we retain our skills. But the workforce will plummet with new technology. But the worst feature is that what I believe the skillful occupations will be done overseas, and the capital-intensive work will be done overseas, and labour-intensive work will be done overseas. And as all we'll be left with is the unskilled work on the assembly line.
So then you see the world car concept, which of course is at the absolute heart of General Motors' global approach to making cars, as being a dangerous, damaging, negative thing for Australia to be involved in.
I would say it is possibly one of the worst things that we can ever face in Australia, because it will not only will it destroy our skills, destroy much of our technology, but even the decisions of government will be taken away from government as to what we must make and what we can't make. Every country in the world, to my knowledge, is protecting its own industries except Australia. We're just being led like a lamb to the slaughter. Country after country, particularly our major competitors, are putting great emphasis upon protecting their industries. And so all we're doing is just pulling our industries down, removing protection, and frankly allowing our industries to be destroyed. And other countries in the world must be laughing to see us doing this. And frankly, I think it's frightening, because we as a country are going to pay very dearly for what we're doing at the present time.
Manufacturing, new technology, the economic squeeze, and what to do about all of them are subjects we'll return to in the months to come. Next week, it's the Commonwealth Games, so we'll be back in 2 weeks' time. Until then, good night.